Hi, fam. So I really kind of appreciated this unit so far, and a lot of the inner teaching and the exercises were fun. I think it's really interesting because I've been in the field for like a while now, and I've mostly done like applied work. Obviously, that's why I'm in the PhD to get the experience to kind of move into the research world. And I've read a lot of Skinner. I'm like obsessed with Skinner. I love to read his books, especially Beyond Freedom and Dignity and The Science of Human Behavior. I kind of like will go back and read them occasionally, but I was kind of like this unit really had me thinking about how I've always like viewed a lot of like what Skinner writes about as a theory. And like of course I know that it like when we apply it we're applying like science, but I've never actually like delved into the research, I guess, like at this level because like we always kind of just went into Cooper or memorized like a lot of the stuff to pass the exam and to work in the applied setting. But it's been really cool to kind of see like how a lot of the things he wrote about have been researched, especially way back in the day. And it's not just like a theory anymore, right? Or maybe it's like still a theory, but there's been a lot of research to develop that theory, um, or add on to it. So I just kind of thought that was cool. And I've been like using a lot of like all of that in like developing FBAs that are more trauma informed and a lot of that stuff. So it's just cool to see that like I'm on the right track. And not only that, but there's like more research to probably make it like what I'm doing currently like better. Um, Especially in the respondent behavior world, which feel like that gets like overlooked a little bit. So anyway, that's kind of my beginning rant. I really wanted to reflect on several of the ideas from Unit 3 and 4 that I found interesting. Um, as we are going into more like operant selection and schedules of reinforcement. Um, and again, I think it just really highlights why behavior analysis is fundamentally a science of environmental relations rather than simply a collection of intervention techniques. And then like thinking about some of the articles that I've read in the class, I was really thinking about like how they want to call it like the biology of behavior instead of behavior analysis. And I think that I'm this class is moving me towards that opinion. Um, One concept that really stood out to me was selection by consequences, um, and how we compare behavioral selection to biological evolution, distinguishing between phylogenetic selection, which occurs across generations, and ontogenetic selection, which occurs within an individual's lifetime through interactions with the environment, which also makes me think of epigenetics and all the research that's gone into that and how that sort of like applies to our field, especially like the cherry blossom study. I think that one's super interesting. But what I appreciate about this comparison is that it emphasizes behavior as a dynamic process rather than a fixed trait. And just as natural selection changes populations over time, reinforcement selects patterns of behavior based on their consequences. And so this idea really helps to explain why behavior is continuously changing as environmental contingencies change. Rather than assuming behavior reflects stable internal characteristics, selection by consequence directs our attention to the interaction between the organism and its environment. Um, and then, of course, there were our basic schedules of reinforcement. And I know that it seems like these schedules are often introduced as definitions to memorize. But I think the real value really lies in what they reveal about orderly patterns of behavior. So, like the fixed ratio schedule produces high rates of responding followed by predictable post reinforcement pauses, whereas a variable ratio schedule produces consistently high response rates with like very little pausing. So these response patterns are always fascinating to me because they emerge reliably across organisms. And the organism doesn't really need instructions on how to respond. Instead, the schedule itself shapes our behavior. This is one of the strengths of experimental analysis of behavior. Rather than describing behavior in subjective terms, researchers can manipulate a single environmental variable and then observe our systematic changes in responding. And the interval schedules really demonstrate the same principle. Under a fixed interval schedule, a responding really accelerates as reinforcement becomes available, producing the characteristic scalloped cumulative record. In contrast, we see variable interval schedules generate relatively steady rates of responding because reinforcement becomes available unpredictably across time. And really, like, to me, what I find really interesting is that these patterns have been replicated across decades of research using so many different species. And that really suggests that they're not isolated findings, but examples of general behavior processes. And it also illustrates why cumulative records became really such an important measurement tool in our early operant research. Yeah, so and another concept that really caught my attention was the partial reinforcement effect, how behavior maintained and intermittent schedules is considerably more resistant to extinction than behavior maintained on continuous reinforcement. I've always really loved this finding, and I think it's so important because it really shows that reinforcement history influences our future behavior. And two organisms may currently experience identical extinction conditions, yet their behavior differs because of the contingencies that previously selected their responding. And that really just to me illustrates a broader point in behavior analysis. Current behavior cannot always be understood without considering our historical variables. Oh my gosh. Finally, I enjoyed really reviewing the concurrent schedules in the matching law. According to the matching law, organisms distribute their responses in proportion to the rate of reinforcement obtained from each available alternative. And I find the matching law especially compelling because it moves beyond asking whether reinforcement affects behavior, and it kind of begins to quantify how organisms really allocate responding among all the competing options. Rather than viewing behavior as isolated responses, it treats it as a process of continuous allocation based on environmental contingencies, and that perspective has had a significant influence on behavioral choice research and continues to really generate experimental questions today. And I think too, from the applied perspective, I always kind of look at that when working with people in group homes, like at the matching law. And I program for the matching law. And I really think about congruent schedules of reinforcement as well. So I think that that all kind of fits together. And for me, I think that the greatest strength of experimental analysis of behavior is its emphasis on discovering lawful relations between behavior and the environment. And just how it's not like random findings. We really demonstrate that behavior changes in predictable ways when environmental contingencies are systematically manipulated. And I know that we're going to move into stimulus control and generalization, and I think these principles provide an important foundation. Understanding how consequences shape behavior over time helps us to better understand more complex behavior phenomenon without relying on hypothetical internal explanations. And really, that's what makes us a natural science. And it's also going back to my original point why I sort of am leaning towards the camp that we should teach more like the biology of behavior. I really like that because I feel like people don't understand what is applied behavior analysis? What does this mean? But I think biology kind of makes more sense in the sense that that's what we're studying, the biology of behavior, like how it works in the environment. And we're measuring it. So that's my little rant. Thank you for listening.